So in the previous two episodes, I explained DDD and DolphJS separately. So I explained what an entity is, I explained what a value object is, I explained what a repository is, what a use case is, and then on the DolphJS side, I explained controllers, components, dependency injection, shields, and decorators. And I also included code snippets for all of these terms. But knowing all these definitions individually is not enough. So the real question is, when I actually open a project, where are all these things located and how do they work together? So that's what I plan to explain in this video. So I'm not going to go through every single file in the styling service folder because this is where I'm using the architecture and DolphJS. You can actually see that in the README of this repository. I'm actually put the terminal so you can see more. Okay. So because there are close to about 100 files or less, close to 100 or 50 in the styling service, so I can't go through every single one of them myself. And I'm not using Prisma anymore to make stuff. So instead, we're going to take one feature, which is occasion, and we're going to follow one request through the entire application. So we're going to start with an HTTP request. We'll see how DolphJS handles it. Then we'll watch it enter the application layer, then to enter the DDD domain, and it's going to be persisted through the TypeORM database. TypeORM, and then come back out as a response. So we're going to follow a flow. So we're not just jumping through random files. You see how they all connect. So we have 4 folders in the styling service. This one is what is compiled when you run dolph build. And actually, let me explain the command you should run if you want to create a DolphJS project. So these are the commands you would run if you're just if you want to get the DolphJS, if you want to install the DolphJS framework and get it running. So you first install the CLI globally, as you do. Then you create a new project, that's Dolph create our vestige, right? Or you can actually do Dolph new, and then your project name is what you would enter in. Okay. Or if you want to do it in this repo, if you don't want to create it, not repo, sorry, folder, you can just do Dolph CLI new, or rather Dolph new docs, not Dolph CLI, my bad. So if you want to generate files instead of having to manually create each file like you see here, you can just run this command. So let me run you through the process again. You run npm install global DolphJS/CLI. Once this is done, you create a new project by using this Dolph new by Dolph app, for example. Then if you want to run the app, you cd into the Dolph app, and then you can run start my bad, npm run dev, npm start, or Dolph start. Now if you want to generate the files, I think I mentioned it before, you can, what you would run, like I said before, you can do Dolph new dot. You want to create the app in your current directory, in your current folder. You want to create a new folder for that. Now, if you want to generate the files, you have a couple of options you can choose. So Dolph generates, you can do -a. So this is going to generate all the files. It's going to generate the controller, the service, the component. If you want just the controller, it's going to be -c. If you just want the entity file, that will be -e. So you can see a list of all of this on the DolphJS doc. Just visit this side. Let me type that. So just visit this site for the docs. Then you go into CLI to see the full list of commands. Okay, so that's that one. Now let's go back into the actual code. So we have 4 folders in the styling service. We have inside the source folder. Inside the styling service, we have app node modules. Then we have the source. Inside the source, we have application, domain, infrastructure, presentation. These are the main folders. Then we have the shared folder where you can just import common code that you normally would repeat in each of the files. So basically, the request comes in from the presentation. So from the presentation, it will go into the application folder. From the application to domain, and then from the domain, it will contact the infrastructure. So it's something like this: application to. Oh, sorry. So this is the path it takes from the presentation folder to the application to the domain to the infrastructure. So these 4 folders: application, domain, infrastructure, presentation. So the presentation folder is concerned, or the files in the presentation folder are concerned with communicating with the outside world. That's HTTP. In our case, it's HTTP and DolphJS, right? Then the application folder, the files there contains the things that the application can do. That is our use cases. Then in the domain, we have the actual business concepts and rules. Then in infrastructure, this is where the implementation details like the TypeORM and the database basically contact the external services. So there's also a shared folder here that contains things that are used across the layers, like our base entity, base value objects, and results classes. So HTTP will let me type that out. HTTP to presentation. That's into application, then to domain, and to infrastructure, which contacts the database. So I should probably add something like this. So now let's take a look at the presentation or the file in the presentation folder. So we're going to go into presentation. So inside the presentation folder, we have an HTTP folder. And then we'll go into the controllers and then occasion.controller.txt. So like I said before, this folder is quite large. It's one of the, I think, what I say, drawbacks of DDD. You're supposed to use it when you have like a very, very complex project, right? So having to traverse between all of these files and folders can be very stressful. So I'm just going to choose one aspect of this styling service so that I can explain the sequence, the flow, right? So you can understand me. And I won't have to explain every file. So once I explain this, you should be able to read the other files and understand it. So occasion.controller.txt. So this controller imports DolphJS, the controller classes, the decorators, the DTO, the DTO, the use cases, the TypeORM repository, and the auth shield. So this here, this is our DolphJS base class, and this is what DolphJS. This is how DolphJS is evaluating a controller. that it should know how to work with. Then this one here is used to send, it's a helper for sending successful HTTP responses. Then these are the DolphJS decorators and response headers. Now let's get into the actual code. So remember what we said in the last video, we have field and route. So this tells us that this controller, this occasion controller, owns routes under the occasions parts. Then the shield tells us that we should apply our authentication shield to the controller's route. So I'm going to come back to this shield later because I just want to follow the actual request. So now let's look at the class. This line 19. So basically our occasion controller is a TypeScript class that extends the DolphJS controller like we saw in the last video. So the occasion controller has two properties: create occasion use case and occasion repo. So the occasion repo is linked directly to the TypeORM repository, and so this controller has two properties: the use case and repo. And if you followed along with the last video, you see that I'm actually making like 3 DDD mistakes which are not meant to be. So let me just explain it first, then I'll go back to where I'm making the mistakes or bugs rather. So the constructor is going to receive a repository, and after we're going to store the repository, this line of code here, and then we're going to, here we're manually creating the use case and passing the repository into it. So let me pause here and then explain the 3 DVD violations I'm making and one other one that I made. So basically, the first one is that I'm importing the repository, the TypeORM repository, which is wrong. The controller is not meant to know that the TypeORM exists, because this is going to cause leakage of the let me say DB concerns into the HTTP layer, which is the controller. And the controller, this is the first one. The second one is the controller is having, so like I said, the first one, it's importing the TypeORM repository, so it's not supposed to have any access to it at all. The second one is that it's having reference to the TypeORM repository, which is not meant to be. This line of code is not supposed to be here at all. It's only supposed to have access to the use case, right? Now, the third one is that we're not doing any, we're not meant to manually instantiate the use case here, right? We're not supposed to do new create occasion. This is wrong, because it's going to, if you later want to change this, we'll have to go through several files before we can change this. It's going to create something called tight coupling, so that's another issue. Then the fourth one is not related to DDD, it's this one here. So this is not meant to be any. In TypeScript, you like to avoid using the any type as much as possible. So DolphJS actually provides the type for the dref. So it's called Dolph request. I just don't want to scatter anything yet. So this is going to be imported from. I'm not going to really write it out. Just going to be at Dolph core. So our DolphJS/core. We will import it from there. I'll check the docs for that. Let me just control this. So this works actually, but it has, well, some bad code in it. So if you wanted to fix this, now, we would replace this rec with what I showed you before. This one will be Dolph response. Then we would completely delete this and this and this as well. So the only thing that we would have in our constructor would be create occasion a constructor. Then we'll copy this, replace this occasion repo here, right? And so basically we're just going, what would you do would be a perfect example of dependency injection. So we'll replace this occasion repo, this, right? Then we would call super. That would be it. So that is mainly what we would have there. Now where the repository would actually be wired in the component. So here we would import, we even have it imported here, right? Yes. So is it incorrect? Yes. So we have it imported here. So we'll type occasion repo is equal to new type ORM occasion repository. Then we would create the occasion use case. Then create occasion use case, then pass in the occasion repo, then call the controller, and then pass in the use case. So basically from the repo, we'll create a variable for repo, right? And we'll pass that repo into the use case. Then from the use case, we'll pass it into the controller. That's basically what it's about. So I'm just going to leave it here so you see an example of some bad code. Now let's actually continue. Now this is the post request, this block. So what it does is that it tells DolphJS that this method is going to handle a post request. We have the direct, which is the decorator that gives us access to the incoming request. Then this one is for the response object. Then here, oh my god, so we have this variable body, and what we're doing is that we're taking the request body and we're treating it rather as a create occasion data transfer object. So we're basically telling TypeScript that treat this value that's coming from the body, right, as this sheet is supposed to have this data transfer object. That's it. Then the use case call, it's called in this side. This is where we're calling the use case, which is wrong, like I said before. So now the controller, okay, sorry, it's not wrong, but we're not supposed to have this repository or anything related to the database in the controller. Was basically, like I explained before, the controller gets the HTTP request, passes it to the use case. Use case does its services, contacts the repo. At the end of the day, you get a response and they pass it back to the controller to return as a response. So that's what it's meant to do. So calling use case is not wrong, my bad. So now the controller is going to delegate the actual operation to the use case, right? So we're passing this, right? Then that's there. So the controller shouldn't decide whether the occasion name is valid or whether the occasion exists or whether the formality level is legal. So that's the function of the application and domain where the use case lies, Yes. So that is all about the controller. Now let's move on to the data transfer object. So we're going to move from controller now. We're going to move to, let me close the presentation folder. We're going to move to application. Remember, this is the path flow we want to follow. Presentation, then to application. So in the application, we have, we're going to see the data transfer plan. Remember, I said I want focusing on occasion. So that is the DT, which is object. Just a couple of lines. So this is the DTO we just saw now in the controller. So this is the structure of what we should be expecting. This is from like what you're going to pass to it. The request is supposed to come in this way. What you're going to return. So basically, a data transfer object is just a data contract. It tells, or rather, it says when the operation crosses this boundary, this is the shape of the data we're dealing with. So it doesn't contain any business data, it's just data shape. That's why you can see it just looks like this. Now let's go into the use case. So we're going to go to, okay, let's go into common, yes, common, then use case interface. Okay, so this tiny interface, yeah, is actually useful because it gives our use cases a common contract. Basically, I request here represent what goes into the use case, and I response, these are generics, okay, and I response represents what comes out. Then the execute function here tells us that every class that is implementing this interface is going to expose an execute function. So the structure of every use case should have this execute function. Now we can call it in the controller like you saw. So now let's go into the actual use case file. So occasion, use cases. Sorry, let's look at create occasion use case. I'm going to put side. So this is our application operation that basically it creates an occasion, right? So it's going to use implements means that this class, this create occasion use case class, is going to promise to follow the use case contracts that we just looked at, the interface file that we just looked at. So you can see it's important at the top there. So the next thing to look at is the constructor. So this is the dependency injection, right, at the TypeScript level. If you remember, when I showed you my bad code, I told you that this is how it's going to look like. And if you remember too, when we go back to the car, and we replaced and we deleted the repo, and we copied this and replaced what was here. That is an example of how a DI implementation would look like. So the use case basically says I need something that satisfies the interface occasion repository, like how it should look like. So it doesn't say it has to be TypeORM, it's just telling you the structure of it. So the first validation here, so what it does is that we're checking that the request exists and that the occasion name is actually a non-empty string. So it's not like just said the name equals quote. So it has to be non-empty. Now we're going to return result.fail. So instead of throwing an exception for this failure, the code is going to return a failed result. The next validation that we did, that we have, this is the next validation now. It checks that a formality level was supplied as a number. Then we're going to check if there's an existing occasion. So now we're going to ask our oh my god, our repository whether an occasion with this name already exists. So if it exists, we reject the operation. You see that with results of field here. Now let's look at. So the next one we're going to look at is the formality level. So this is actually a value object. This formality level. Let's go back up. See, it's a value object. So let's look at that soon. Don't worry. So we have a formality level, the variable. So this is where one of the DDD concepts that we discussed in the previous video actually becomes real. This is where we're going to see the live code. So let's actually open the file now so that you can see it. So it lives in the domain. It lives in the domain folder, and then occasion, then value object, and formality levels. So the actual value object validates that the level is an integer from 1 to 5, and then it returns a result. This is the validation logic here. So if it's not, it's going to fail here. If it is, it's going to, like, if it runs successfully, it's going to be result that okay, pass this. So formality level is a value object because we're not really interested in giving 5 its own identity. Remember, in value objects, the value matters more than the identity. While for entities, it's the opposite. For entities, the identity matters more than the value. So for formality level now, we're just here to enforce some rules that the formality has to be between 1 to 5. That's what this if condition here does. So if it's valid, we create the value object. So let's go back here. Let's see here we check if there's a failure. So what we have here, does it return failure? That's what .is failure does. So if it does, it will return a result of fail. So if not, then the formality level gets created successfully. Next, we are going to create the occasion, right? So let's actually look at the occasion entity. What does it comprise of? So let me go here. So the actual entity extends from the base entity that we have in the shared folder. So it's what the base entity exposes is the name and the formality level, and then it also provides a static create factory. Let me also publish see that. This is the base entity. Then it has the ID. This is how the base entity looks like. So let's go back. So we have name, formality level, and then create. So this props interface just tells us the properties that belong to an occasion. So that's name and formality level. Then we have get name. Then we have the get formality level. So these are getters that expose the properties without exposing the internal props object directly. And we have the static factory that gives us a controlled way of creating an occasion. So you don't have to do occasion.name equals blah blah blah, occasion.formality level equals blah blah. This one does it in a clean way for us. So the base entity let's look at it ourselves. So this line here, it tells us that if an ID was provided, we use it. If it wasn't, we generate a UUID for it. So this equals function here helps us to compare entities by identity. So we're comparing their IDs. So rather than simply comparing whether their properties are identical, we compare their IDs so we don't have duplicate entities. So now let's look at the repository abstraction. We are done with this use case. In case you're not aware, we've done everything. So now we want to actually look at the final part of the use case, which is this repository, the saving, the contacting, and all of that. So let's go into the repository. So it lives in the domain. This is the interface repository. Remember, the repository, we have the repository interface that gives us the structure, and then we have the repository that lives in the TypeORM, that lives in the infrastructure that contacts the database. So this is how it will look like. So this is the repository abstraction. So it's basically telling us that if you want to be an occasion repository, you need to know how to perform these operations: save, find by ID, find by name, and find all. So this interface lives in the domain layer. So it knows the contract, right? The structure. So the infrastructure is what supplies the actual implementation. Now we're going to look at the entity in TypeORM. If you don't know how to use TypeORM, because I did not do a crash course on that, I would advise you go through their docs. It's pretty easy to get. Then the entities in TypeORM is different from the entities in DDD. Just wanted to mention that. So the entities in TypeORM are just like define the entities in DDD. We're going to go into infrastructure, then database, then entities, and occasion entities. So this one is just to describe, define, let me say, the database model. So correct me if I'm wrong though, but that's what it does. So this code here uses the TypeORM decorators and maps the model to the occasions table. So it's going to have the UID, the unique name, the formality level, and the timestamps. So this line here tells TypeORM that this class represents the occasions database table. Then this here is that tells us that the ID is a UUID primary key. Then this column here tells the decorators how the properties should be stored in the database, right? So this class we're seeing here, this whole thing, is not our, let me say, our domain occasion. You'll soon see how that looks like. So you can see here we have name, formality level, created at and updated at. That's it. Now let's look at the persistence mapper. Remember when I said mapper is like a middleman? Now we're going to see how the code actually works. So mappers live inside the infrastructure. So the mapper now. So the mapper has a 2 domain and 2 ORM. And when I was explaining it in the last video, I said 2 domain and 2 persistence. So the 2 persistence here is 2 ORM. So the mapper is the translator between the domain and the ORM. to the toDomain function basically tells us that the DB representation comes in, but the domain entity comes out. So we're just going to like match the structure of how the domain looks like. We're going, not the domain, my god, of how the ORM, the database looks like. We're going to now convert it to how the domain should actually look like. Then the ToORM here is going to convert the the domain to the ORM. So it's just doing the reverse. So this toDomain is going to return something like it's going to return something like, you see this line here, name on ORM entity, the name, multi-level, and then ID. So basically we're going to take in the raw ORM entity and reconstruct it to a proper domain occasion. So see here we have occasion.create from that domain entity. Okay, now let's look at the TypeORM repository now. So I've already shown you how the domain entity looks like before in this video, so I won't go over that again. So now let's look at the TypeORM repository for occasion specifically. So it lives inside this folder here. Okay, so we're going to scroll up now. So the current implementation uses remember we looked at this before, the occasion repository. So it gets the TypeORM repository from the app data source here and maps between the ORM and domain representations here. So this line here is going to do the implementation of the repository contract. That is this. Okay, now this line here, this dot repo app data source again repository blah 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 here is going to tell us, basically helps us to contact or talk to TypeORM. Then inside the save function we have ORM entity is equal to occasion persistence mapper.orm. So convert the domain to persistence, so convert the domain to the ORM, so we can actually save it and convert it back again when we want to drop the response. So we're then going to ask TypeORM to save it. So this .repo.save is actually from TypeORM. Then we're going to return, what we're going to return back is we're going to convert the saved database representation back into the domain object. So that is basically what the save does, and you can basically figure out what is remaining. Find by ID, find by name, and find all does. Now the final part of this video now is the components plus the server. So I'm going to go back to the presentation folder. So I'm going to enter components, occasion.components. So the current component registers the occasion controller and the TypeORM repository. So what it does is that the component groups the controller and the repository into a DolphJS module. That's just basically what it does. So we're just trying to let DolphJS know about the controller and the repository. Next, we're going to, let's go to our server.cs. This is where the app actually builds. So this line you see here is for connecting to the database. Then this line here, is telling we're giving DolphJS the components that make up the application, and then we start the server. So we have looked at DDD files, the structure, how it works, what it is. We've also looked at the DolphJS syntax too in this project, in this folder. So what we started with a simple operation. We created an occasion, so like creating an occasion, and it took us across all of this. So DolphJS handles the HTTP side, the DTO, data transfer object, defines how the data should look like. The use case coordinates the operation. The domain gave us the business objects and the rules. The repository defined what the persistence needs to be able to do. The infrastructure contacted TypeORM and our database. Then the DolphJS component and app bootstrapped the framework to wire together and work together. So that is all for this video. The next video we're going to actually look at the algorithms. Okay, the backtracking algorithm and weighted graph algorithm with heuristics scoring and a couple of other things actually. So that is all. Thank you for watching, and I hope you subscribe and leave a like and any comments actually.